Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. In this video, I'm going to show you a game where black won with the Czech Benoni. Yes, it sometimes happens. I know I've been dissing the opening over the past, well, a few videos. So this is the Czech Benoni. The centre is locked. And I really like white space advantage. And this is the reason that you don't really see it in classical chess at the top level these days. You know, players don't like to play with little space. But it was more popular in the past in regular tournament play, you know, with strong players. Here we're going to look at the game between Flohr, Salo Flohr and Bent Larsen, played in Copenhagen in 1966, and around about that time it was reasonably popular. You know, you had players, there were strong players that dipped into the Czech Benoni like Larsen. Geller played it sometimes, Petrosian. So yeah, it was more popular then. I think, you know, these days research is a lot better, aided by computers. And the problem is when you look at this with a computer, it really doesn't like black's position at all. Anyway, what are the advantages of playing this with black? Well, it's about complexity, really. All the pieces are on the board. You know, white cannot exchange pieces here. So at some moment, even if white has the advantage, we're going to get a full-on struggle with all the pieces. Nothing exchanged. And Larsen plays an interesting move, g6. Now, I've looked at a couple of games where black plays bishop e7. But g6 is interesting. I mean, this basically leads the game into a kind of King's Indian, where black has voluntarily played c5. Now, is that a good or a bad thing? Well, I would say it doesn't really help black's position because white can actually engage in on the queen side very easily. But it does lend some solidity to black's position as well. And putting the bishop on g7 rather than e7 is frankly more dynamic. Flohr sets up pretty well. You know, this is a very respectable system for white. Bishops are in decent positions. You know, white can think about playing g4 to squash black on the king side. We've seen that in, well, played by Prague, played by Kasparov. This is a standard strategy in these kind of positions. And at the moment, yeah, this break on the queen side, well, they'll lose a pawn. I mean, black could play like that, but anyway, that's another story. Knight h5, so the typical King's Indian move. Basically, I think Larsen does that before white plays g4. So if castles, then g4 is very tempting just to squash black, and this is a very, very standard strategy. So that's why knight h5 was played. Queen d2, maybe white's going to go queen side. You know, in any case, the queen is good on this diagonal. Castles. And here, of course, if white castles, then f5 is the standard kind of King's Indian move, and we've got an interesting position. But Flohr plays g4. Now, this is really provocative. If the knight goes back, then obviously, you know, white has gained so much time here. This is just a glorious position for white. Knight g3. You can even go for knight f5 very quickly, actually. But, you know, f3, h4, h5, or knight g3, followed by f3, h4, h5 is just an automatic attack for white. So really, whether this move is good or bad for black, it just has to be made. You have to cut across white's strategy. So Larsen gives away a pawn. So what's he got for the pawn? Well, that is a pretty zinging bishop down the long diagonal. That's pretty good. The e file has also opened. And this square, e5, is available for the knight. And where is white's king going to find a safe haven? On the queen side, you could be hit with b5, and don't forget that bishop. On the king side, the pawn is on g4, makes it a little loose. I think white would very much like to put the pawn back on g2 here. So it's tricky, and of course if that knight is exchanged off, then that bishop has no opponent. That is a pretty good deal for a pawn. So the bishop dropped back to cover f3 and to step out of the way of the knight. Well, here, what is black going to do? How are you going to try and shake up white's position? I suppose the move one would really like to play is f5. But that's incredibly risky because after this, and let's say rook g1, I would be pretty nervous here about that bishop. I mean, the knight can block, but it doesn't feel right at all. Bishop h6 can start to exchange pieces. Doesn't look good at all. White still has the option to castle the queen side. So Larsen plays b5. Now that's much more like it. Now he's got to stir up trouble before white consolidates the position. So that's another pawn thrown in the pot. And once again, f5 looks a bit dodgy to me because of rook g, takes and rook g1. So Larsen plays rook a4. Now we can see things are happening. Black is 2 pawns down, but the activity is pretty nice, considering that white's king is in the middle and white is having to defend here. So the rook threatens the e-pawn. Knight c3. Hitting the rook. The rook moves into the middle, attacking the queen. Queen e3. Okay, white seems reasonably solid here. f5, I think, has certainly more point to it now, particularly when the king can't castle the queen side. But Larsen just played very coolly here, actually, with rook e8. And this does turn out beautifully. So the rook is simply on the same line as all these pieces, which doesn't look bad. But it's a very cool move as well. You're giving... You're not particularly rushing it. You're just saying to white, well, okay, what are you going to do with your king? If it goes kingside, then obviously with the pawn on g4, things are a little insecure. Let's shift this rook here and go f5. Tricky position, very tricky. I mean, you can say that all black's pieces are active or have the potential to be active. The bishop on c8 is actually very well placed. The queen also has the potential to fly out to the king side, and of course all the other pieces are in play already. So it's tricky. I can understand why Flohr didn't want to play castles. Instead he went queen g3. So I suppose, stepping out of any tic-tacs on the e-file. Nevertheless, I have a feeling Larsen would have been overjoyed to see that move, because he now got in g5, hitting the bishop. Now that spells disaster on the dark squares. So bishop e3. Now, lovely move by Larsen. I mean, nowadays it just feels very standard. You just aren't bothered by the bishop attacking the rook. You just want control over these squares. Knight g6, lovely move. From a positional point of view, black is doing so well now. Makes room for the bishop to come to e5. And the queen can follow up as well. And if bishop takes, well, this just leads to disaster, really. Rook takes e4, and white is getting crushed there, actually. Okay, back we go. Knight g6 just played. Bishop b5. And Larsen definitely wants to sack an exchange. What a position. Knight takes, rook takes. And now really the king has to get out. I think on the queen side, with the bishop here and the queen so far away, I think white will collapse very quickly. I can imagine moves like, yeah, queen a5 or queen b6 look fantastic. So castle's kingside. Nevertheless, this is also gives black a fantastic attack. So hits the bishop, bishop d3, bishop e5, hits the queen again. Queen goes back to d1, and now queen f6. So Larsen is just taking control of these dark squares beautifully. Rook still active. I mean, all these pieces, all black's pieces look fantastic. a3. Difficult position for white already. Knight f3 check. King up, and now bishop takes g4. I mean, everything just flows so beautifully here. Well, taking the bishop, of course, will lead to mate very quickly. So Flohr gives up his queen. Now, he does have 2 rooks for it, but black is so dominant here. And remember, the king is absolutely safe. I mean, I think that's really important. You know, white simply has no counterplay here. He's the one defending. Bishop e4 attempts to cover some light squares here. Bishop takes pawn. Yeah, it's not getting better. Check, king g7, rook b8, bishop c3. And Flohr took this, because if bishop takes rook, then bishop d4, but actually knight f3 is a crushing move. So now if the king moves, then you can play bishop takes rook, because d4 is covered, so bishop takes. And now the queen moves in to the king side. So at the moment, let me see, black has queen and a pawn against the rooks. But these rooks are not in a healthy position, and white's king is dreadfully placed. These pawns are weak. Yeah, it's winning. Rook d3. So white is just hanging on, because if bishop takes rook, again, bishop d4 check. But black doesn't need to get flash here. Bishop e5, rock solid. I do like that move. You know, the dark squares, that's really what this game has been all about. So now this bishop is pinned. Queen takes rook. Rook g4, again, an attempt to defend. Hits this one, h6. Rook d2, and now just queen takes h3. And here, Flohr resigned, understandably. Black has a very simple strategy here. f6 was played to protect this pawn, and basically the queen is going to move and the h-pawn is going to advance, and white simply can't hold everything together here. It's completely winning for black. Yeah, that was move 40. I assume they'd reached the time control, and Flohr could reflect on the wreck of his position. Flohr, good player. Well, he was, yeah, a world championship or contender, or thought to be a world championship contender in the 1930s. But yeah, by 1966, he was way past his best. Nevertheless, a very nice game from Larsen. So I think this game shows that there are dynamic chances with the Czech Benoni. And I think the important thing is you have to seize your moment very well. And Larsen did that brilliantly. I mean, he understood instinctively that he was going to get some kind of compensation for the pawn here. And second pawn sacrifice was excellent practical idea. But I would say don't look, if you're going to play the Czech Benoni, I would say don't look at it too long with a computer, because that will really depress you. I think you have to know the practical ideas, you know, where interesting pawn sacrifices are, when to go for f5, for example, when to break out. These things are not easy to judge. Here, Larsen got it absolutely spot on. Norway Chess is beginning, so I will be dipping in and out of that tournament if there are some interesting games. So yeah, stay tuned and thanks for watching.